So let's talk about flight controls. I've got my controls more or less dialed in, at least for now. It's always a work in progress, but I've got a setup that's kind of working, still playing with the ergonomics. And as I said earlier, it's a joystick setup, so I'm going to just tell you a little bit about that, but maybe a few comments on the quality and the capability of these various bits of equipment. So what have I got? I've got a centre mounted joystick. Now I say centre mounted, that's going to be important for reasons which will become apparent, and independently of that I've got a throttle. Now I'm mixing and matching my equipment here. I've got a Virpil joystick and a VKB throttle. I'm going to focus on the Virpil for most of what I say, but just to start off with, let's contrast the two. Now it's not strictly fair to compare the quality and the capability of these two devices. This VKB is from the Gladiator line, which is relatively the low end of their equipment. They do have a line called Gunfighter, which is more on a par with the Virpil stuff that we'll... And the main issues there are the gimbals in the Virpil are exclusively made of well engineered from metal components. In the Gladiator there's a lot of plastic in there. Now I'm not using the Gladiator as a joystick, so it's worth saying the Gladiator product, it is sold as a joystick, but they do this adapter. I mean, if you have a close look at it here, it's got this strange offset configuration. So what happens is the grip is detached from the joystick, and there's an adapter called the Omni throttle adapter, which comes in a left-handed and a right-handed variant, as does the grip. You can get that pre-configured, which is what I did when I bought this. So it came pre-configured like this. So it is still a 3-axis joystick. We've got the back and forward, we've got the left and right, and there is a twist grip as well. At the moment I'm just using the 1 axis, and you'll see that axis is not sprung. I mean, it has the capability to be sprung, but the springs are disconnected in this mode. We still could map the other axis if we wanted, or indeed the twist axis. The other thing to say is there is a variable resistance that can be dialed in to the action of this axis, or indeed the other axis, with tunable clutch, dry clutches they're called. You have to take the thing apart to get at those, but that's, once you've got that dialed in, it allows you to set up the feel of that quite nicely. Other than that, on this VKB controller we've got a whole bunch of buttons and switches on the grip, and a few on the base, including an analog axis on the base, an encoder wheel, and just various kinds of switches. So that's the VKB, and it's mounted on VKB's own table mount, which is, it's what it is. It's acceptable, puts the thing in roughly where I want it. Anyway, so moving to the stick, which is the most important thing. Now, I should say, by the way, I've got this set up in what people might consider a left-handed setup. So I've got a left-handed grip, and the throttle's on the right. Now, why have I done that? Well, I guess it's because I learned to fly in an aircraft where that was the setup. It was a Cessna aircraft with a yoke in your left hand and throttle in your right hand, and I just got used to that. And so why not set it up that way? The downside of that is you have less choice of grips. The VKB grips are available in left and right, I think across their range. For the Virpil sticks, although there is a range of different grips, they're not all available in left and right-handed. So in overview, what I've got for my stick is, I've got a Virpil Mongoose T50 CM2 base, say more about that in a minute. It's on a Monster Tech table mount, and it's the long version. And the reason it's the long version is it allows you to mount the base much lower down, and the reason for that is because I wanted to use a stick extension. And the reason for that is, these are all, you could go into these things at great length, but having a longer throw on the joystick is generally regarded as more realistic. It gives you a more precise control, but it has implications. In particular, with the Virpil bases, you have two choices essentially. You've got I suppose what is the flagship base, which is the Mongoose T50. Now, this is the CM2 base, the current one is the CM3 base. The difference there is the CM3 base, I think I'm right in saying this, is essentially the same as the CM2, but it has the tunable dry clutches for each axis, which essentially allows you to damp the, if you watch that, that'll just oscillate if I let it go in each axis, and the clutch would stop it doing that. But more importantly, you could tune the resistance or the feel of the, it's kind of like an inertia control in a sense. So the CM3 base has that, the CM2 doesn't have that. Other than that, you know, the engineering is, I think, pretty much similar. You've got a choice of 3 different spring weights. There's a standard, a light and a heavy. Now that's important because when you put an extension on, the feeling of the stick becomes sloppier, all other things being equal, because you're operating that spring action on a longer lever. So what you need to do is put in the stronger spring, most likely. I mean, I've put in the stronger spring action. You can tune the spring preloads for each axis independently. You can do that from the top with the Allen key adjustment. Now the other choice of base you have with the Virpil stick is what they call the Warbird base, or the current version is the Warbird D. Similarly, there is an older version of the Warbird. The reason, by the way, I've got a CM2, not a CM3, is I bought this used on eBay, so I don't have the tunable clutch action. Moving back to the Warbird, similarly the Warbird D has the tunable clutches. The Warbird older version doesn't have the tunable clutches. I did have a Warbird to experiment for reasons I won't go into. I had to send it back, but that was again a very impressive piece of equipment that I would have no hesitation in buying another one. The internals are different, but still, you know, all metal, very high standard. Actually, the thing I didn't mention was in the Mongoose base, as well as a selection of interchangeable springs, you've got a selection of interchangeable cams. I think with the CM3 base you could literally get 5 different cams or cam sets, because there's a cam independently for each axis. So the differences essentially there are, you get cams that have an aviation profile, which means that the resistance increases towards the outer extremes, and then you have cams with a profile that's designed for space sims, I think, which basically has a linear resistance. And in each case you've also got a choice of having a positive kind of notch in the centre, or having just a free floating. I mean, it still centres, but not quite as assertively. So coming back to the Warbird base, you've got a similar set of interchangeable cams, interchangeable springs. 2 differences that I've noted which are significant for me. The Warbird base, it has a wider, what do you call that, displacement, you know, the angular displacement out to the max in each axis is wider. Now that has implications if you want to put an extension on in your stick. You know, it's going to hit, I mean, if it's a central stick, it's going to hit your legs in the aileron travel. In the other axis you're going to maybe hit the desk or hit your gut. So what they do say in their literature is that the Mongoose is really the best choice if you're intending to use a stick extension. But also that spring tension is important as well. It has been said, I haven't verified this myself, but it has been said that the spring action, even with the heavy springs in the Warbird base, is still a little bit light if you use an extension. There are different extensions. This is a 200mm, 20 centimetre extension. It's a kind of a gooseneck one or a swan neck, which brings the action a little bit further back, and it also has a slight forward tilt on it, which is helpful. They do sell other extensions. This is a 10 centimetre extension, and they do, I can't remember what sizes, but they do a number of different ones. These are all ferociously expensive, by the way. So, but if you can get them used, you can save a little bit. So that's one difference. If you're going to use an extension, think very carefully about getting the Mongoose rather than the Warbird. Now the Warbird, you can optionally buy super heavy or extra heavy springs. So that's another, you know, you're going to make, if you want to use an extension, you can probably make it work with either base. The other thing that's important to consider is and it may not sound important when I first mention it, but you know, your mileage may vary. When you actually get into this, you know, particularly if you're having a centre mounted joystick, you know, that's going to interfere with, depending on your seating arrangement, it's going to interfere with the chair. You know, in a real aircraft, your seat would probably have some sort of cutout for the joystick. Why am I telling you this? Well, the Mongoose is, I think, 27mm, almost 3 centimetres taller than the Warbird base. So that's just a factor, again, in making everything fit together. You know, some people will mount these joysticks at the side and the throttle at the other side, and then, you know, whether or not you use an extension, the ergonomics are different. Virpil does, by the way, do its own table mount. Here's one. I got this as a package. This is almost brand new, although it was used. Got this as a package with the Mongoose base and a grip, and this weighs over 2 kilos just for the mount. Now, I'm not using this mount for a couple of reasons. One is it brings the stick away from the table further. It's not quite long enough for what I wanted, so I did buy the Monster Tech mount. Monster Tech mounts, they're great actually, very sturdy, not too expensive, but they come from Germany, and the shipping is astronomical. I mean, it weighs about 2.5 kilos. This one, the shipping was about 40 euros or something, which is about, you know, 50% of the price again. What else to tell you? Right, the grip. Now then, this is a Constellation Alpha grip, left-handed variant. It's the only grip, as far as I know, in the Virpil range currently that comes as a left-handed variant. The older sticks were, in fact I have one here, because it came with this used Mongoose base. I say used, again it's a used stick, but it's pristine, it's brand new, you know, these things were virtually unused when I bought them. But this is the older style Mongoose grip. This is a right-handed version, but this came in left-handed. This is the Mongoose CM2 version, which is a later variant. These are modelled, I think, on Soviet fighter jet grips, and they're great grips, but you can't get them in left-handed anymore. So, coming back to the Constellation Alpha. I mean, it's just an amazing, it's very expensive, got to say, but this is the one part of the Virpil stuff that I bought new, simply because I wanted the left-handed variant. You get 6 analog axes, so you've got elevator, aileron. There's a twist grip. I've got the twist grip locked at the minute, just for ergonomic reasons, so that's a 3rd axis. You've got a little kind of a trigger here, which is, I don't know if you can see that, but it's I think it's often used for a brake, but that's an analog axis. You've got a, what looks like a hat switch here, but this is actually a mini joystick, so another 2 axes there. Apart from that, you've got hat switch, hat switch, hat switch, some sort of 2-way hat switch thing there. You know, there's buttons. You've got an encoder wheel there. There's a button down here. There's a trigger, but it's a dual trigger, so it's got 1 click if you pull it harder, 2 clicks. You might have noticed something there, which I'll come back to. There's a flip up and down trigger. I mean, it's just amazingly configurable. You've got a little wrist rest there, which can be moved up and down. So the one thing that you got a little preview of there is, as well, there's a kind of a translucent edge here, which has got RGB lighting in it, which you might think is a cosmetic factor only, but I have found a use for that. A difference from the Mongoose, this will only be probably relevant if you're trading up, but a difference that was evident right off the bat is the Mongoose is longer, or the Constellation Alpha is shorter, which means if you're swapping grips, you know, it does affect the operational height of your joystick by a few centimetres, but you know, its ergonomics is significant. That's one difference. The other difference, which subjectively, the forward tilt on this Alpha is larger than the forward tilt on the Mongoose. So I've been experimenting with the control setup. As I think I mentioned in a previous video, I have tinkered with setting up some of the GPS controls on the VKB stick. I did that in FS 2020, I haven't done it in 2024 yet, but that's one thing. But that's all done with fairly conventional mapping. I had to use spad.next to access the GPS control mappings. That's the only wrinkle there. But for my main flight controls, I've been setting up the Virpil. Now, one thing to say about this that's very different from, my controls in my previous incarnations of my flight sim have all been based around a yoke, and the yokes have all essentially been dumb devices. They connect to the sim and they just send the axis information or the button clicks, and everything's done in software, either in the sim or in FSU IPC or spad.next, or one of the many other control programming systems you can get. Now the Virpil, you can use it that way, but the Virpil is extraordinarily, it's a little computer in its own right, and you can program it, you can update the firmware, you can save profiles, you can do all sorts of things. If you're familiar with FSU IPC from back in the day, one of my comments on FSU IPC was, when you get to know it, I'm talking about the registered version of FSU IPC, if you could conceive of something that you wish you could do with an analog axis, or a button, or a combination of buttons, or a combination of buttons and axes, you could probably do it in FSU IPC. That software was developed over many years, iteratively, to the point where it was so flexible. The Virpil controls essentially allow you similar flexibility to FSU IPC, but inside the device. So you get this, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, you get this configuration suite. I suppose the first thing to say is these devices are built around contactless sensors, like most modern hardware, with very high resolution. I think I read that the resolution of the X and Y axes is 0.02 degrees. That's 1/50th of a degree, which is insane. And if you look at the device movement in the joystick test program, it's just fantastically smooth and precise. But you've got all the usual options in there for calibrating an axis, scaling an axis, smoothing an axis, creating a response curve, a dead zone or dead zones. You can link two axes together to keep them in step. You can create virtual axes from button clicks. You can program button triggers onto different axis regions. You can create virtual detents. You can attach a shift button to an axis, so an axis can be mapped to two different things depending on whether or not you're holding down a button, which is an amazing function. There's a zoom function, which again, similarly to the shift, I think the zoom function does something like, when you hold a button down, the precision of the axis is increased by a definable amount while you hold that button down. So I guess you're trading, it's like you're zooming in on a very small part of the range of the axis. And then there's a trim function. Now the trim function is amazing. Rather than map your elevator trim, I'm thinking of elevator trim in particular, rather than map that in the sim, what you can do is you can change on the fly the center position essentially of the stick. So I've got this programmed at the minute where I've got a particular button mapped to initiate that trim function. So I put the stick where I want it, press that button, and that's the new center position. So if I let it go, and now although the stick has mechanically returned to center, it's essentially operating from that held position back here. And again, there's different ways in which you can use that, but the way I've got that is that mode with the shifted center position stays in operation until I press that button again. So when I toggle that off again, that shifted center point is removed and the stick is now as calibrated. Now of course that's a perfect use of that RGB LED that I mentioned earlier that's available on the Constellation Alpha, because in the setup you can attach a LED to the operation of that shift mode. You can do that for, I think, the zoom mode as well. But in this case, the way I've got it set up, that tells us at a glance that we're in that shifted or trimmed mode, and then we can immediately see when we back out of that mode. That makes elevator trim, so you could argue that it's less realistic. I don't know, maybe there are some aircraft in which that's how the trim operates, but it's just fantastically usable. You know, you can be climbing out, and instead of holding the stick there while you're climbing out, you could just click into that trim mode, let the stick go. Now it's important not to lose sight of the fact that that's not a indicated airspeed hold. You know, just kind of tempting to treat it that way. It sort of is, but not a very robust one. We're cruising along here, kind of level-ish, not exactly level, about 105 knots. And without touching the throttle, I'm going to pull us into a fairly steep climb, and we're just going to hold it there. So we've got about 80 knots. I'm now going to press that trim button, see the LED illuminate, and if I let go, we're going to keep that attitude, still controlling the ailerons, because we've got a bit of a roll going on there. But we're still climbing at 900 feet per minute, more or less. So then if I go and switch that trim mode off by pressing the button again, you can see the attitude goes back to the natural, uncorrected attitude. Something else I thought I would just draw attention to while we're here on the ground is, so there's my stick in the cockpit, and you can see it's following the movements. What you're going to notice here is we've got a discrepancy. We've got side to side movement and back to front movement is different. The back to front movement is linear, and the side to side movement is not linear. In fact, it's exponential. This is a feature that is held over from FSX and P3D, which is that the sim scales aileron input exponentially. Now this, in case you're wondering if this is set up in the control setup, we're just going to back out and have a look at that. Controls. So we're on the Mongoose stick, we go to hardware settings. That's the aileron control, which is perfectly linear in terms of what the hardware is sending. The elevator control likewise. So there's no scaling in the axes inside the simulator, or rather we haven't imposed any scaling intentionally, but we do have that scaling automatically. If we want to fix that, well, it's not really fix it, we can mask that by tweaking the curve in here to counteract it. So we've got an exponential scaling on the ailerons. So what we want to do is we want to add a curve which is essentially a logarithmic curve, which is the inverse. So we'll do that by putting in sensitivity of, I don't know, we'll try 50%, 0.5, that's above and below the centre. So what that's actually doing is amplifying our inputs close to the centre, and as we get further out it's attenuating them, which is hopefully going to do more or less the inverse of what that built-in scaling does. So if we go back into the sim, so elevators as before, ailerons now, well, it's still slightly non-linear, I think. There's a slight speed up, but nothing like that major speed up that we saw. Now whether you want to do that, whether that's going to be a good thing to do or not, that's for you to decide, but that's how you can fix it if it's important to you. Last thing to say, my rudder pedals, I've got the VKB T Rudder Mark V. There was a Mark IV which was, I think, essentially the same, except it had like cylindrical foot pads, more like on a helicopter. Now, when I say more like on a helicopter, these are 2-axis only. So you've got the pedals, but you don't have any toe brakes. Now that may be a deal breaker for some people. There are many other ways you can configure your brakes. So I think the benefits of this system outweigh the downside of not having brakes. So the main benefits of this system, again, contactless sensors, but it's very compact, takes up relatively limited floor space, but the action is basically up-down rather than the traditional parallelogram, which would be like this. And there's a number of ergonomic reasons why that's useful. Configurability, to configure this is a bit of a pain in the backside actually. You have to dismantle the whole damn thing to get at there's a mechanical cam set up in there. You can't swap the cams as such, but you can flip it over. Well, I suppose you can swap the cams. There's basically 2 cams, 2 profiles. One's got a central notch and one doesn't. Now I've tried it both ways. Without the central notch, it's not very satisfactory, and one of the reasons for that is the spring action. I mean, the spring action is tailorable up to a point. It has 2 positions. Again, you have to dismantle it to flip the positions, but even in the strong position or the heavy position, my one criticism of this is it's pretty much far too light. So it's kind of, the consequence of that is if you sit with your feet resting on the rudders, it is easy to, without realising it, even if you've got the centre notch on, in your resting position, be off centre. So you need to look out for that. But I've not seen any chatter about putting a heavier spring in. I don't know if there's any particular reason why that wouldn't be a good idea. But beyond that, these are good. I mean, they're functional pedals. They allow you to do the steering on the ground, working in a crosswind with some precision, ergonomically. Because of this up-down action, you don't have to anchor the pedals so that they're not sliding away from you. That's what I've got. So that's my full complement of controls for now, but more experimenting to do, and I'll keep you posted.